Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on Cambridge International AS and A-Level Global Perspectives and Research. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm Georgie Robinson from Cambridge University Press, and our A-Level Global Perspectives author David Towsey will be presenting to you today. You may have noticed that your microphones are muted, and they will stay this way as we go through the session to avoid any background noise. And David and I are also both hosting this webinar from home. So if there are any issues with our internet connection, then please do bear with us. There'll be time for a Q&A session for 15 minutes at the end of this webinar. So please be thinking of the questions you'd like to ask as we go through. We also ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions, so they don't get lost in the chat. If you're having any technical difficulties with sound or video, please let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to resolve them. We recommend you use headphones to listen to this session for the best sound quality. If you're unable to see the Q&A or the chat icons, please hover your mouse at the bottom or the top of your screen and they should appear for you. As a quick reminder, we'll be covering a range of topics today, including academic writing, engaging with other perspectives, and much more. This session is also being recorded and may be uploaded to YouTube at a later date. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to David and we'll start the session.
All right, thank you, Georgia. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and it's lovely to see so many of you here, and a very warm welcome from me as well. As Georgia was saying, this webinar really is about key problems and solutions for the classroom. So it's really about some of the issues, but also the opportunities that you can explore with your students as you're teaching global perspectives. To put a little bit more on that, I'm going to look at 5 things in today's webinar. One, although I'm sure I don't need to convince you of that, a little bit of context to start with. What's special about Cambridge Global Perspectives? What are we trying to develop in our students? Why is that important to just focus us a little bit on what we're trying to do here? Secondly, engaging with other perspectives. How can we help students to do that? What are the skills that are required? How can we make that work in the classroom? Thirdly, academic writing skills. Obviously, writing academically is a really important skill across the curriculum, but it's something that is developed and tested specifically on Cambridge Global Perspectives, both at the essay component at AS and in the research report for A-level. Visual and oral communication skills have always been something that's very important, both in the classroom and in the presentation that students have to do as part of the team project. There are some key changes for the team project in the new syllabus, which makes visual and oral communication even more important and something that we can focus on in an even more productive way. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, just bringing it back all together, I'll be talking about organizing the course and that journey that you're on with your students, which we might summarize as moving from teaching to facilitation, moving from developing some of those key skills in a more directive and supported way to setting the students free, encouraging them to be more independent, giving them the tools to do that as they build their skills. So that will hopefully bring everything together and give you some ideas as well for organizing the course, developing your delivery of the course at the end. Okay, so starting with our first topic, what's special about Cambridge Global Perspectives? Well, as the diagram shows, I think we can think about global perspectives in 2 different ways. One, the kinds of attitudes, values, ways of seeing the world that we're trying to develop in our students that are really important. So introducing them to different global contexts, helping them to see different perspectives and how they differ from their own. But there's also some skills that underpin those values, attitudes, ways of approaching things, some personal skills, communication, collaboration, reflection, but also academic skills as well as they analyze and evaluate and make arguments. So just to go back on them in a little bit more detail, we're using global context as a hook, if you like, for developing the different skills in the students. It's something to make it concrete, something to make it real, something to show them the importance and the relevance of the concreteness of what we're trying to do with them. So there are all sorts of global issues around us. Um, Ideas for how you might organize them are listed in those global topics in the syllabus. Um, and the idea is that they're all of contemporary relevance. It's about the here and the now and why those things are important in the world today. But we're also trying to make some connections to things that have a local significance too. So with the team project, that specifically asks for each team is selecting a global issue which has local relevance to them. But it's about making that connection between the two things. Why? Where I am right here, right now in my community. Why do these big global issues matter? Why is the way the world is today so globalized, and why is it impacting on how I am now? So it's just about helping students to understand that and getting them engaged. Alongside that, there is also just that development of different perspectives. These are alternative ways of seeing the world. Students, in fact, all of us find it really easy just to talk about our own perspective, our own view, how we see the world, how we think it is from our point of view. But it's seeing that our point of view isn't the only point of view, that our perspective isn't the only way of opening up different people and possibilities in the world, and just being able to acknowledge that for perfectly good reasons, other people, groups of people have very different assumptions to us, very different arguments, draw on different things that they value to support their views, and respond to that, either agreeing, disagreeing, somewhere in between, but understanding that difference is something that we need to understand and engage with rather than just ignore or skate over. So that's the learning, that's the classroom journey that they're on. That's why we're wanting to do it. But underneath that, there are these really important skills, and it's the skills that are actually being assessed. We're trying to actually ensure that they have those skills. And for any candidate who does this, we can sort of see these skills developing and we can measure how far along the journey they've got. So as I said, those are personal skills, being able to communicate effectively, being able to collaborate. But how do you show you're collaborating? You're reflecting on that. You're reflecting on how you interact with other people, why that's important, what was good or bad about that, what was strong or weak about that, and just reflecting in general about what you're doing and being able to take a step back from it. And then there are those more specific, targeted academic skills, the ability to analyze, to break things down, to evaluate, to judge the strength of something and come to a conclusion about it. Synthesis, drawing together different bits of evidence, different bits of argument, and show how they work, and making arguments yourself and being able to spot when other people are making arguments. All of those things are really, really important. So moving on, how are we actually supporting learners to develop these skills? Well, in a number of different ways. This diagram, hopefully in many ways, should be quite familiar to you. This is the critical path. This is the big idea behind the journey of skills that students are on when they're doing global perspectives. So deconstruction is the first one. I think it's probably helpful to think about deconstruction, which sounds like quite a sort of big and slightly unfamiliar word, as analysis. It's breaking things down. It's being able to say, out of all the possible issues, angles on something, what's the one that I'm going to focus on? How are they different from one another? Looking at different arguments and actually breaking those arguments down. What's the conclusion? What are the reasons? Where's the evidence? And on the back of that, being able to say how strong or weak each of those is. So it's a kind of fundamental skill that's underpinning everything. If you can't spot what you're dealing with and break it down and name it, it's then very difficult to do anything with it. So that's why that's really the kind of the skill that we want them to begin to master first of all. Once they've done that, they can move on to reconstruction. That's the synthesis bit that I was talking about. It's really combining different arguments together so you can see how they share things in common. They make up a perspective, how you can group different points of view so that you can see where the debate is. You can build evidence together in order to make arguments of your own. So having been able to break things down, you're then building them up in controlled ways to be able to compare perspectives, run a debate. And then you're making conclusions on the basis of that. It's important to say why you think the thing that you think. I mean, again, students, and particularly students in that 16 to 18 age group who are typically doing this qualification, it's very easy for them, as we all know, to make arguments, to say what they think, but not necessarily to support that, to actually come to a conclusion, but to show how that conclusion is related to their evidence. So being able to step back, reflect, okay, so on the basis of this evidence, on the basis of these arguments, what do I think, is really important. But what's also important is just to make sense of your own work and learning. What have I done? How did I work with those other people? How much did I learn from this project? Of course, the reflective paper and the team project test that specifically, and our students do a little piece of writing that focuses on that. But reflection is really important throughout the whole qualification, and being able to take that step back and build reflective skills is something we want students to do. And then finally, communication and collaboration. It's not really at the end, it's something that goes throughout the critical path. And in doing all of these things, making arguments, breaking them down, reaching conclusions, then students need to be able to communicate that. They might communicate it in an essay using formal academic written communication, or they might do it in a formal presentation, and develop those formal oral communication skills as well. And as they're communicating to an audience of an examiner or their peers with their finished piece of work, behind that, they're also, for some of the time, working effectively together with others. And so collaboration is woven in through everything that they do. And so that's the framework that we're working with. There's a journey that we go through it, but probably the most effective way of teaching global perspectives is to think about repeating that cycle again and again, building up those skills, giving the students the opportunities to practice. And sometimes some topics, sometimes you might be focusing more on deconstruction, sometimes you might be focusing more on reflection as you introduce each skill a bit more heavily. But when we're thinking about the critical path, I just think it's really important to think about how you're repeating this cycle and going back, giving the students the opportunity to practice, to get feedback, to get better and better at these skills, which remain the skills throughout the year or even 2 years that they're following this course for. Okay, so the first, having set the scene a bit with that context, the first sort of problem, if you like, but also opportunity, is how to get students to engage with other perspectives, because that is really hard for all of us, but perhaps particularly for A-level students who are doing this course. I think the first thing that we need to think about is the anatomy of perspective. If we were going to dissect it, to break it down, what is a perspective actually made up of? And if we're developing skills, we need to do that. We can't just say that perspective is just a worldview, just a point of view, just an attitude that people share and other people disagree with. If we can break perspectives down and see what they're made up of, we can get students to see that too. They're deconstructing the perspective, and then we can get them to get better at those individual skills behind analysing, evaluating, judging those different parts of perspective. So as the diagram shows there, perspectives are made up of arguments. Arguments are made up of reasons and conclusions. So a perspective is a range of related conclusions about a particular issue or idea or topic. And those conclusions are supported by reasons, because what we're teaching is that you can't just come to a conclusion. You need to make an argument. Your conclusion needs to be supported by reasons. And of course, what do those reasons need to be supported by? They need to be supported by evidence. So we'd be expecting, if it was a strong perspective or a strongly argued perspective, to see the evidence there that is being put forward to support it. And I think what we will then find is that perspectives are made up of similar kinds of evidence. So a perspective that looks at global warming and thinks that it's a problem because of the evidence of climate change, and values aspects of temperature change or rainfall patterns and numerical types of evidence, statistical types of evidence in that way, you might expect to see more of that kind of evidence and other kinds of evidence. Behind that, there might also be assumptions being unstated reasons, things that might actually be put forward explicitly in a perspective, but you need to accept, in order to accept that person's point of view, they're assuming that there's shared judgments, shared values that don't even need to be mentioned, but once you actually name them, you can see why that person or that group of people are thinking that. And there's also particular context. Perspective might be arising from a particular group of people from one part of the world, from one socioeconomic group, from what cultural group, that share those ideas, and that they come from that kind of context, and that's why they have those conclusions, those reasons, that kind of evidence. So actually just breaking it down and saying to students, this is what we mean by a perspective, this is how it relates to what we've been teaching you about, is really important. We said at the beginning that some questions at the end would be great. I've dropped in through the presentation some questions really just for you to ask yourselves silently, to get you thinking. So those might be things that you just think about, help you to relate it to your own students, but might also give you ideas for asking things at the end, or dropping us a line afterwards and we can follow up with you. So first question, thinking about this, engaging with other perspectives, what are the barriers, the things that are holding back the flow of engagement with other perspectives? What are your students, your own students, finding difficult about that? And how might you deal with those particular barriers? How might you unlock those for your students? Just kind of one thing just to think about as we're talking. One way of sort of helping students to get past those barriers might be to think about learning about other perspectives or engaging with other perspectives as a process. And it's a process that you can build students up with from the very start. You know, you can get them to practice this at the beginning of the course and see how they're getting better at it as the course goes on. So the perspective process might go something like this. Students start off by stating their own view. That's the easy bit. So here's an issue. What do you think? What's your view? What's your gut reaction? Okay, you know, have a view on it. And it's okay to have a view on it. Then just stop and listen to other views. This works particularly well in group activities in class. You can get 3 or 4 students together, give them an issue, and just give them a framework of instructions. Time them. Each person states their own view. They have a certain amount of time to do it. Then they can listen to other views as they go around. So that discipline of, okay, I know what you think, but what do other people in the room, other people in your reading, other people that you see on the internet, the television, what do they think about it? I just listen to it without responding immediately. And having listened to other views, don't just repeat to restating your own view. Now you need to explain your view to those other people by breaking it down. And they'll get better at breaking it down as the course goes on. And of course, by breaking it down, by deconstructing it, what we mean is, well, what's your conclusion? Okay, so why do you think that? What are your reasons? What evidence are you using? Are you using any evidence? Reflect a bit. Are there any reasons you haven't stated? What do you really think about that? So just understanding, do they have evidence or reasons to support their view? What are the assumptions that they may have that may not have even thought about? And then having done that, and maybe listen to other people doing that too, or read other arguments and said, well, what's their conclusion? What are their reasons? Where's the evidence? Diagnose differences. So why do I disagree with that person? It's not just because they're wrong and I'm right. It's because that's my conclusion, that's their conclusion. I'm using these reasons, they're using those reasons. I'm relying on my evidence. They've got different evidence. Or maybe they just assume different things about the way the world works and what's important. And it's about that understanding that's probably the hardest bit that we're trying to get students to be able to do. So thinking about that process, repeating the process, where are they on it, formatively assessing them against it can be a really good idea. And as I said, there's loads of different ways that you can use to practice that process. As I've just been saying, discussing their views with each other about an issue and just doing it orally, that's a really good starting point. You can then move things on a step and just give them a selection of texts around an issue. Make them really short, short editorials from newspapers. Maybe take a longer argument from a piece of writing and break it down yourself, hack out some paragraphs so you've just got the conclusion and some of the main reasons and bits of evidence, and get them to practice with that. Highlight where the conclusion is, highlight where the reasons are, group those arguments together almost physically by moving them around and putting them together into shared perspectives. Once they've done that with something that's really controlled by you, with the text that you're giving them, they can then support themselves by beginning to learn a bit about research. So how can I find some similar arguments? Where would I look? Where's the best place to find an argument that's likely to be supported by evidence and reasons? Where can I find reliable ones? So they're finding, and then because they're out there in the wild, they might have to do that breaking down process. Okay, that's a really, that's several pages worth of argument. Where is the main conclusion? Where are the reasons? And they begin to do it themselves, but still repeating the process. And you can do that throughout the course. One of the most helpful ways of running the course is to have a look at all sorts of different issues. Don't spend too long on each issue, but use the issue to send them off researching in another direction, give them a different range of articles, get them to have a new discussion in class, but come back to the same process. So it's that process that you're focused on all the time, about getting them to break arguments down, combine them together, draw conclusions, reflect on those, communicate their findings. So those are some ideas really for just engaging with that process of different perspectives and the skills that they need. Another skill that's really, really important, and that we've focused probably more and more on as time has gone on, is academic writing skills. I mean, those obviously for post-16 students are really important for them to develop across all sorts of courses that they're doing. So it's not just global perspectives, but again, global perspectives, because it focuses so explicitly on those communication skills and ask them to just write academically and choose their own question, choose their own issue, but focus on the skills that they're using to do it. It's a really good laboratory for being explicit about those skills as they might apply to this subject, to a range of subjects, and just help them to develop those. And you can focus on a range of things in doing that. But perhaps one thing just to think about is challenging times generally in the classroom, but what are your learners' challenges with academic writing? Again, something to think about just while I'm talking, and which of these ideas might actually be more relevant to your students, be something that you need to develop more in them from where they're coming from and the level they're operating from and where you want to take them to. Okay, so I would say that in terms of developing academic writing skills. And by this we mean in the essay, especially in the research report as well. There are three main areas of skill that are being assessed, are being valued, but also that you want to really develop in your students and get them to focus on. The first main area is sequencing ideas. It's actually producing a structured academic argument that's appropriate for the debate between perspectives that this course involves. And producing structured arguments is one of the things that's most valued at this level of qualification, but also the most challenging to develop. So one starting point talked about is just this idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is a very old idea about writing essays. But essentially what it is propose your argument, propose some opposing views, so you've got your debate, and then use the rest of the essay to combine them with one another, use one to challenge the other. So here's one view, here's another view. How is the first view supported? How does the second view challenge it? What do they have in common? Where do they differ? And on the basis of that, how are you going to reach your conclusion? So that is one idea that you could use just generally to think about on the biggest level, how are you going to organize your work and check your organization against that. Effective introductions are really, really important in essays. The first paragraph sets the tone, it sets the direction, it sets the focus. And by the same token, if it's unfocused, if the debate isn't clear, if the key ideas are missing, it's harder to recover from that. So a lot of really, really focused work, and I'll show you an idea about this in a minute, around just writing and honing an introduction without launching into the rest of the essay and practicing that for different questions might be something really valuable to develop in students. When they move on to the main body of their essay, signposting is probably the most important thing. So 3 lines of argument, what's the first one? What's the second one? What ideas are they contrasting? I think, X thinks this, but Y thinks that. Where do ideas build on each other? Moreover, they're developing, they're supporting one another. So just signposting clearly where each argument is when you're turning to a new argument, where you're contrasting arguments, that's what you really need to be sort of getting them to plan and then see if they can stick to that plan when they're writing. And then the conclusions are really important. You need to be able to get to the end of the essay and what's your judgment? And that needs to be really clear. It needs to be really relevant to your question. It needs to be really relevant to the evidence and the arguments that you've raised in the course of your writing. And some of those need to be summarized in the conclusion so you can see just how the different parts of the essay hang together and how they relate to one another. So sequencing ideas is something that's really, really important, really, really crucial. Academic language is, students get hung up on this, but often clarity and simplicity is the way to go. What's the simplest, clearest possible way to communicate my ideas? And what's the most appropriate phrase? That is really closely linked to sequencing ideas and signposting them. So if I'm contrasting ideas, I should be using something like, however, on the other hand. If I'm building ideas to arguments, moreover, Smith agrees with this. X builds on Y, and making sure that those phrases are being used, but they're the right phrase to communicate what the student actually means. And then citation and referencing. And it's not just kind of, what's my style sheet? Have I got that right? It's, why is this important? I need to be able to show where my ideas are coming from. I need to be able to show what my idea is and what the other person's idea is. And I need to give others the opportunity to follow up on my evidence so they can reach their own conclusions. And thinking about, even if I'm paraphrasing somebody else's ideas, I still need to acknowledge them. It's not just quotes that need to be acknowledged, it's paraphrase as well. And that keeping track of my sources and creating a bibliography as I go along and using a consistent system is really important too. Just a couple of activities that you might use with your students. I won't ask you to do them now, but just have a little think about how you might use those. I find that a really effective activity for almost any topic is you've debated it. This one, for example, should the English language be used as a global method of communication or not? Um, Students might propose their ideas. They might have done a little bit of reading about it. They've got some stuff to say, but make them say it in 100 words. And often students would respond with absolute horror at this. How can I do it in 100 words? But it makes it an activity that you can run 20 minutes, half an hour. But it also is something that really forces them to make every word count and follow that structure that you've given them really precisely. So what's my view? What's the opposing view? How are they different? What is my conclusion? How do I support that? And by breaking that down to its bare bones, you can then run through all of those 100-word essays, and you can use that framework to assess it. Have you got an idea? Have you got an opposing idea? Have you got a conclusion? Have you supported it? And use a checklist to actually get them to focus on those skills in a way that's really manageable and they can see it within just 100 words. So that's one idea. Here's another idea. Here's the first paragraph of a student's essay. And you can do this with paragraphs that your students have produced. You can make up your own. And just get them to read it and then ask them maybe 3 colors of highlighter pad. We know that effective introductions set the scene, highlight the key arguments that you're going to address, and mention some of the key terms just to keep you focused and make sure you then kind of keep focused on those terms throughout the rest of the essay. So get them to read it and then get them to highlight it. So having read that, what they might do is come up with something like this. So that first bit, it's a common belief in the world today that in order to achieve happiness, one needs to conform to social standards and be economically successful. But is this the case? It's a complex idea. That sets the scene, that's your context. Happiness is clearly a key term in this essay. And then there's some arguments. Here's argument 1, here's your thesis. Some studies of happiness argue that personal happiness is based on a person's perception of their own economic prosperity. It's about how rich you are. In contrast, other research based on psychology claims we cannot produce a universal definition of happiness because how it's viewed depends on culture. So you've got those 2 key arguments there, and some of the ideas behind each argument might be economics on the one hand, culture and psychology on the other. So just getting them to see that, maybe highlight it in their own work, and not worry about the rest of the essay at this stage, but just to hone that introduction and get it right might be a really valuable thing to do. It's not just writing though, it's visual and oral communication skills as well that are tested on this course and are really important in today's world for students to have. In many ways, they'll be asked to do this in the world of work and perhaps higher education, as much as they'll be asked to write effectively. And with the new syllabus, it's actually even more important. There are 3 big changes to the team project, which are summarized here for 2023. First, this AO3 communication is assessed more. It was 28% of the total, it's now 35%. If you look at the presentation, in fact, what's going to be focused on nearly 50% of the assessment is communication in the presentation. So communication is just really more important. To support that, but also to support the team project's focus on sources and being able to identify and evaluate sources in more detail in a way that's a bit more similar to the essay. It gets longer. So they're going to have to actually produce 10 minutes of talk. rather than just 8, or that's going to be their maximum. They'd have to go up to it, but they're going to be given more space. And another key change is that whereas now we're just asking for live performances of them, what they are going to have in 2023 is a choice. They can either stand up, present live, or they can produce a constructed presentation. And by that, I mean they can record their voice, put it over slides, put it over a poster, and they can edit it, they can put it together, and they can submit that recording if they like as well, which might have some practical benefits as well in the classroom, particularly if you've got lots of students. But it also just gives some more opportunities to think about different ways in which we can communicate. When you're thinking about those skills of effective communication, in many ways, they're the same as the skills for writing. We're just thinking about how might that look when you're speaking. So when you're planning it with them, get them to think about the structure. A good presentation is going to be made at the beginning, where they introduce the topic, introduce what they're going to talk about, a body where they develop their ideas, and an ending. They're going to organize, introduce, and summarize their argument. The beginning might be shorter than an essay. The conclusion will certainly be shorter than an essay, but they still need to have, I think, that 3-part structure. And within that structure, they need to signpost it. And they need to signpost it maybe even more intensely. As I said, as I'm about to say, just repeating that point, coming back to what I was going to say, because as you're experiencing right now, you don't have a script to refer back to. You can't read this later, although we are recording it. So the speaker, when you're actually giving a presentation, needs to be much more attuned to that. You need to take your audience with them, remind them where you're going, where you've been, where you're heading to, repeat those key ideas as well. That's really important. It's also important to support your argument visually, and that's something that students can do in a number of different ways, and we want to actually develop that skill and reward that skill as they produce their presentation. They might do it through patterns of regularity, consistent typography, other visual elements. You'll see from this presentation that Cambridge University Press have really kindly given me a template with a consistent color scheme, logo in the top left, and I'm worked within that, and that helps me to make each slide consistent, to have the title in a regular place, to have a regular typeface so you know what each bit of the slide is, and you can recognize those elements as you move from slide to slide. Get your students to find their own ways of doing that. Don't make it overcomplicated, but think about how you give them examples of working to a template or creating a template. Secondly, the answer isn't always a slide. We all use PowerPoint or other presentation software with slides, but they can do an academic poster like that first image there. Or if they're presenting live, they can use an object, hold it up and explore it. So slides may be the answer for them, but not always the answer. And bold images can very effectively replace words. And don't be afraid to talk over an image, to have an image with a keyword, and to use that image to talk about how that image supports their argument is a really valuable thing to do. Third and final element is just to think about the language of speech. How does my language work differently if I'm speaking than if I'm writing? And you can actually teach that. You can be explicit about that with your students. In effective essays, we might use complex sentences with subordinate clauses to build in different ideas. When we're speaking, simple sentences are almost always the way to go. Or if we're going to join together ideas, compound them with and or but. Don't use lots of complex sentences. Keep it simple. Directly address your audience. Think about how you're going to do things. Use that you word to engage them, and just using language in that way, using a particular choice of word is really helpful. Think about a variety of sentence functions. Don't just have to describe your argument. Ask your audience a question, even if they're not there in the room and it's a constructed presentation. because that helps you to organize your ideas. If you're showing an image, say, look at the top right there. As you can see this um, in this diagram, if you look at that bit. So you can actually direct your audience as well and vary those sentence functions, and then build rhetorical patterns. Use patterns of three, use a controlled hyperbole, use repetition, use contrast to help you structure your ideas and plan that in your scripting. And you can actually talk about those language skills, show them examples, and get them to practice it. The final thing that I want to look at is just that bigger picture of the course as a whole. How we're taking students on this journey where we've been quite directive at the start, teaching them about what is an argument made up of, how do I evaluate evidence, to getting them to practice those skills and then use them independently and just check how they're doing it themselves and help them as a support to get better at it. They're on a journey. And that's what teaching global perspectives is really about. We're structuring those different skills on the critical path to take students on a journey towards not being able to do it, not knowing quite what those skills are, to facilitated independence. Maybe not total independence, but independence that you've given them, that you've created a framework for, that you're supporting them with. So the course might start with learning the core skills of analysis and evaluation, then exploring, that's deconstruction, then exploring how to research and combine sources using those skills, then combine those together, put an essay together, maybe a 100-word one to start with, build up the length, see how it puts together and building those academic writing skills, work in a team and learn how to present. That's a kind of, it draws on the other skills, but it also stands on its own as they do the team project and they do a presentation. And then, of course, as they move into the final A-level component, if they're doing that, select a topic of their own that responds to their own academic interests for the Cambridge Research Report. And then you're mentoring them through the research and writing process and checking what they can do. And there's a little more detailed version of the diagram just to finish with that. And this is how I've structured the course myself when I've taught it, but also how I've tried to structure the chapters when writing the course book to support. So, for example, at the beginning, try out the whole process, do an introductory project, get them into groups to share ideas about a topic, practice that, and then say to them, look, you shared an idea, you listened to and broke down somebody else's idea, you communicated what you thought, you came to a conclusion about it, you reflected on the differences. That's the whole course. We're just going to get better at it as we go on. So start off with an introductory project. Then you can start teaching directly the core skills, and that's going to be a bit more teacher-led. But then you're going to start to let go. Give them a research task, model it, send them away to research, come back with their conclusions, and they're building up reconstruction skills because they're having to combine resources to do that. Then focus on writing the essay. That's communication, written communication, but it's also a bit of reflection. And initially you're doing it for paper 2, the essay, but it's the set of skills that they're going to need for the research report, because that's very similar as well. So you could, having built up all those preceding skills, you can repeat them, practice them, but also introduce academic writing and how they're technically going to put that together into a piece of writing. And then the final thing that you're going to throw in is, let's work as a team, let's collaborate with one another. I've done a bit of that in group work, hopefully, earlier on, but they're going to do that in a more formal way, and they're going to learn how to present. They're going to learn how to adapt their skills of written communication to oral communication, and they're going to learn how to use those other skills on the critical path in making a presentation in the team project. So hopefully, I think we started a couple of minutes late and I finished a couple of minutes late, but that brings me to the end of what I had to say and share with you. And hopefully we might have some questions also.
Thank you so much, David. That was really insightful and useful. And I can see there's lots of conversation happening in the chat about the topic. So thank you to everyone who has taken part in that and shared their thoughts. It's been really insightful to listen and see what everyone is talking about. And we do have some questions in the chat. I've answered some of them where I can already, but I'm just going to put some of these to you now, David. So the first one is from Priya, and they ask, having taught this subject for 5 years in a row, I feel that there isn't enough of deliberate focus on exploring how assumptions shape perspectives. Do you have any interesting exercises to help with this?
Yeah, and I mean, I think Priya raises a really interesting question because, of course, our students differ, and we might, and as we teach each year group, we find that some elements might be more challenging for them, and assumptions is one of them, and that's probably one of the harder things to teach. And I think I'd probably say two things about that. The first thing is just think about where your students are coming from and make sure that they can develop those other skills as well, because you can actually get a long way with analyzing a perspective without looking at assumptions. It's more important to know what's the conclusion, what are the actual reasons that are being given, what's the evidence, and then comparing that with other arguments to build a perspective. So think about, do I need to devote so much to assumptions with that group of students, or can they actually go a long way and produce really effective work without it? So that's the first thing. The second thing to think about, though, is what's really hard about assumptions is their negative reasons. It's the reason that's there that's not stated, and how do you talk about something that's not actually being stated? And I think preparing an argument for students and leaving that gap and talking about that gap is a really good teaching technique. So what I've done in the past is I haven't shown them the actual argument. What I've done is I've put a slide up which just says one line, what's their conclusion? Okay. What are the reasons? A line each. And then put a little blank box between the reasons and the conclusion and said to them, okay, so we know what the conclusion is, we know what the reasons are. Do those reasons really strongly lead to that conclusion? Are they convincing support for that conclusion? And the answer from the students will often be no. You know, how do you get to that conclusion from those reasons? And the gap is the assumption. There's another reason which they are putting in there that supports the conclusion, but they aren't actually stated. Once you put it in there, it's a stronger argument, and that's your assumption. So, and then you can teach that. You can say, right, okay, if you're looking for the assumptions, start off by just evaluating the argument. If those reasons don't seem to be leading very strongly to that conclusion, what do you think they assume? And you know, that if you're looking at, for example, like environmental arguments, they might all be assuming that protecting the environment is more important than economic development. If you're looking at economic arguments, it might be the opposite, that actually those reasons that are all to do with people's wealth lead to that conclusion about something else. But actually people's prosperity and people's well-being economically is the most important thing. That's their assumption. So I think breaking things down into arguments might help in that way.
Perfect. Thank you, David. We have another, I guess, an area for thought maybe from Nabia, and they say, my students who have only STEM backgrounds are finding it very difficult to follow the critical path, empathy and perspectives, because they haven't been encouraged to think critically or reason. And do you have any advice in this area?
Yeah, and it can be challenging, and it depends very much on your student group. If you're lucky enough to have some students who come from maybe more of a humanities and social sciences background and there are other subjects, you can combine those with the STEM students and actually get them working together in groups and see how they could help one another, because it might be that some of the STEM students can help with quantitative sources of evidence, explain some of the science topics that come up on the course, but the students from a humanities and social sciences background can often come up with a different point of view that's a non-scientific response to that science issue and get them to see it. Or if you don't have a sort of a friendly humanities student, you can just challenge them with what if. Okay, so that I can see how you're supporting your perspective, but what if someone might say this? You might disagree with it, but why are they drawing on what's right, or why are they drawing on something cultural? Why is that important to them? Why are their values or their beliefs coming into this? So you can challenge them in that way. You could also talk about, which is actually very important and comes up on many science courses, the ethics of science, because that will be something they will be being taught on science courses. You can't just do what you like in terms of scientific investigation. You have to think about its impact on the people you're working with, its impact on others, its impact on human beings and their well-being. So making that link and talking about that and saying that these are some tools to do that might help to make more sense of it for them.
Thank you. And the next question we have is from Mariam, and this may be more suited actually for Cambridge International, but you may have some thoughts on this, David. And that is, why do we have this subject separated from English? Why is it so unique?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that probably is more of a question for Cambridge International, because I don't make the, yeah, that's something they've done. I mean, I think probably my best stab at it would be that there are some big similarities between global perspectives and a subject like English. I've talked about structuring essays, academic writing skills, research skills. But if you look at something like English, there's also a core of subject-specific knowledge. You're writing about plot and characterization. I can talk with sympathy about this because I'm also an English teacher. I've also taught English, and actually when we're doing English, we're talking about the technical features of poetry. We're talking about a writer's vision and way of constructing a world and way of building character, and none of those things are dealt with by global perspectives. So there is a difference, but I think what we're trying to do with global perspectives is help our students to see those underlying skills. And it's one of the only subjects really that focuses on the skills and assesses the skills. I mean, even something like English, it's skill heavy, but you still need to know your novel, know your poetry, perhaps learn your quotations if you're doing an exam. Here, we're focusing very much on those skills, and by separating it out, we're giving space for those skills. And yeah, it's a really interesting subject to do in itself, but it also helps to support other subjects by being separate. So that's not the official answer, but it's my best answer.
Thank you, David. So I can see there's lots more questions rolling in, but I'm really sorry. We've actually come to the end of our session now. But what we'll do is we'll follow up via email if any questions that we've had, and make sure we get some answers to you. Thank you so much for attending this session today. We do hope you found it useful. It was great to see all your comments in chat. And thank you also to David for taking the time to present to us today. We very much appreciate it. As we said earlier, we will be uploading a recording of this session to YouTube, so you'll be able to revisit the webinar and share with your colleagues should you wish. If you tick that you'd like to hear more from Cambridge University Press, we'll be in touch over email with even more great content from David, and we'll let you know where you can find out more about our new AS and A-Level Global Perspective series. So that leaves me to say, have a good day wherever you are, and thank you again on behalf of Cambridge University Press, and goodbye for now.